It's hard to know, of course, what the early modern elite would have made of ballads. They were familiar with them, that we know. Any number of figures testify to their familiarity with ballads and their intense emotional responses to ballads, including Sir Philip Sidney, whose picture you can see at the end of this essay. What they would have found had they gone to ballads is a genre that's intensely interested in questions of madness, and also in the line between thought and non-thought. The ballad was actually a fairly subtle instrument for purveying thinking that seemed like thought, but might be or might not be. There were also Tom of Bedlam ballads. There are a number of these extant, and they probably represent a great many more. In this ballad, a mad figure issues forth from his cell to see if he can make sense of the world. It's not quite clear whether he does. It's a disjointed, rambling poem that sort of adds up to a distinct sense of ominousness. And of course, in any number of ballads, you have a chorus, fa la 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 la, it comes after the verse, and doesn't seem to make much sense, but I guess it leads the mind along a path of its own. Even more interestingly were medley ballads. There were really quite a few of these. And what they are is they're made up of jumbled fragments of other ballads, random observations, all cobbled together in a way that seems to hover just on the edge of significance. Here's a verse. It's from a ballad called A New Merry Medley. It's the second verse. There was a young damsel both bonny and brown. If I live to grow old, for I find I grow down. Fourpence, halfpenny, farthing. A tailor's no man. Now there was an old prince, and his name was King John. I would have a figgery, but where is my wife? A dish of good meat is the stay of man's life. As you can see, it's not as if no statement in that ballad makes sense, but how they all hang together isn't quite clear. There are random observations. Some seem to point in an historical direction. Some seem to point to the singer's immediate life. He seems rather confused as to what's going on. He can't locate his wife, but at least he has recourse to stout old maxims like a dish of good meat is the stay of man's life. He's not even clear on the direction of his life, it appears. Is he growing old or is he growing down? He just doesn't seem to know. Presumably there was a great deal of pleasure to be had in this semi-coherent, jumbled together mix of observations. The very unmeaning of it was precisely what the ballad singer performed, and for the pleasure of himself and for his company. Of the Tom of Bedlam ballads, I was particularly drawn to one called Bedlam's Schoolman. It's a later ballad, but I think it's very apropos for the Ophelia's Mad scene and the kind of ballad she sings. The conceit of this ballad is that it's made by a, quote, English nobleman that was in Bedlam. That is, member of the English aristocracy who went to a madhouse and has since emerged, and now fancies himself something of an intellectual, I guess, because he's a schoolman. And he uses the occasion of the ballad to ask a lot of probing questions in the same semi-coherent fashion that you see in other ballads of this sort. Some of these queries are really quite profound, like, fain would I know what makes the roaring thunder, and what these lightnings be that rend the clouds asunder, and what these comets are on which we gaze and wonder. So this sort of ex-mad nobleman fancies himself something of a natural philosopher. So just as we see in the selections from William Cornwallis, it's actually possible to use the ballad under a certain mad guise to touch on the very boundaries of knowledge in the period. But interspersed with these quasi-scientific observations, there are, as usual in ballads of this sort, a number of analyses, open-ended analyses of what society is like, and couched in the same tone of wonderment, and they too have a kind of a edge to them. For instance, our mad schoolman observes all the world's a-gadding, running and madding, none doth his station hold, he that is below envieth him that riseth, And he that is above, him that's below despiseth. So every man his plot and counterplot deviseth. We might think here of Ophelia's observation that there's tricks in the world, and her way of looking at the court and then speaking its truth to it through ballads, but in a way that's masked to many of the courtiers. Here, as in her scene, pointed truth emerges by a circuitous route, a musical route, through performance of a sort that aristocrats perhaps cannot take on board. And in the same vein, the schoolman continues this way, and I'm rapt with admiration when I do ruminate, men of one occupation, how each calls him brother, yet each envieth other, and yet still intimate. And here I think we touch on what the ballads were for early modern people. Yes, it may be true that there are social dislocation, that there are problems and conflicts, that what the balladeer calls envy permeates social relations, and yet everyone remains intimate in the sense that this is a very close-knit society. People are invested in other people's opinions about them. They're very preoccupied with their carefully calibrated position in the social hierarchy. And what they need is a vehicle in which they can articulate to themselves and to one another what they understand about themselves and one another. All of their tacit hostilities, their competitiveness, their tacit allegiances, the full complexity of their social lives that perhaps wasn't always able to be expressed explicitly. Yet I think it could find an expression in ballads. And here that which sum it up, as we've seen, a very, very complicated, nuanced understanding of human motives, of social life in early modern England. And this, I think, is what Ophelia is bringing into the core, all this rich, dense, oblique social understanding. Perhaps it's more than the courtiers want to take on board. Perhaps it's more than they can take on board. But I think it resonates within Shakespeare's play very powerfully. As the mad schoolman says, "Look, look, what a bustling, here do I espy, each one another justling, each one turmoiling, one another spoiling, as I did pass them by."